Hey FBell. So as I mentioned on Planbook and in my instructions on Google Classroom, um, you guys are at a disadvantage because on the last Friday, before school closed, FBell didn't meet, and then as we were following the Bell schedule, we started digital learning on a day 5, and FBell doesn't meet then either. So in an effort to get you guys caught up with what you would have done in class on Monday, I'm kind of going to walk you through the Google Slides as we would have worked through it in class. So you'll notice on the first slide that William Blake appears, and there's this chart that on the left-hand side asks for the poems that he wrote and that we studied, and then the romantic characteristics that he's interested in. I would have used this as an anticipatory set to have you guys kind of review what we had read the previous class. So let's talk briefly about the poems that he is responsible for, or I should say that you all are responsible for remembering that he wrote. So we read 4 poems by William Blake, okay? The first was Little Boy Lost, and then we read Little Boy Found before reading from The Lamb and the Tiger. All right, so remember these poems were published in 2 collections of poems. One was called as I erase my board. One was called Songs of Innocence, and the other Songs of Experience. And he did this, remember, because he wanted to represent the 2 states of our human existence. And we talked about how Little Boy Lost and Little Boy Found are both in the collection Songs of Innocence, and The Lamb is also included in that collection. And then its counter poem, The Tiger, is included in the collection Songs of Experience, and they are meant to reflect these opposing states of our existence when we are innocent and young, and children essentially, and then when we become older and more experienced because we have, lived life and experienced things that cause us to lose our innocence essentially. So the romantic characteristics that he's interested in obviously are childhood, the experiences of childhood. He's also interested in nature. He talks about the lamb and the tiger, which are both animals that exist in nature. You could say that he's obviously interested in the imagination. Remember, he was considered a visionary poet because he saw visions that he attributed to his relationship with the divine, essentially. So even this kind of relates to an interest in the supernatural, right? And in Little Boy Lost and Little Boy Found, we have the appearance of God, right, who shows the little boy back to his mother. So the next slide would have really just gotten you to think about this new romantic characteristic that our next poet, William Wordsworth, is really interested in his poetry. All of his poetry reflects an interest in nature, all right? And so I asked the class, and perhaps this is something that you all are thinking about right now in the the current state of our world, right? Like where are we able to find peace and tranquility when we are filled with the everyday stresses and strains of life? The prompt says that sometimes people visit a specific place, maybe a church or temple, while others may seek out the comfort of a grandparent's home. And then obviously Wordsworth is going to argue for a return to nature. And this is actually going to be, I'm kind of talking ahead now, this is going to be related to the homework assignment that I'm going to ask you guys to do while we are, digital learning. I think it's really important that you guys get outside. It's beautiful outside today, all right? It's Thursday when I'm recording this video, but it's like 70 and sunny. And I know that we're supposed to limit our contact with people, but you can certainly go outside. And I'm going to ask you to journal about your experiences just after spending 5 to 10 minutes outside, for homework each night that our class meets. So, like the prompt says, we would have shared places where we found peace with each other, right? And then I would have moved into introducing you to William Wordsworth, all right? So he grew up in a very natural setting. He grew up in this place called Lake District, all right, which is in the western part of England. And as its name suggests, it is an area that surrounds a lake. And he lived there until his parents died. And then he left to go to school at Cambridge. And during this time, he became caught up in the spirit of the French Revolution. And this was where a lot of his, ideas came from. And then when he was finished with university, he reunited with his sister, Dorothy, and moved to Dorset, which is still removed from London. It's in the southern part of the country. And that's where they became friends with Coleridge. Coleridge is the poet that we're going to read from next class. Remember, Wordsworth and Coleridge together are considered the two poets who launched this romantic movement with the publication of their collection of poetry called Lyrical Ballads. And so Dorothy, Samuel, and William were kind of like the three amigos, all right? They were inseparable. Wordsworth and Coleridge would bounce ideas off of Dorothy. And, it was during this time that they wrote their collection of poetry called Lyrical Ballads. He was named the Poet Laureate in 1843, so that just goes to show how important his poetry was. That's the highest honor that can be bestowed upon anyone, any poet. And then his masterpiece, which is called The Prelude, was not published until after his death. All right, so moving on. Wordsworth the Romantic. In his prelude to Lyrical Ballads, he writes that poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, right? It takes its origin from emotion, recollected in tranquility. And remember, he believes that we are most tranquil in nature, right? So obviously the romantic characteristics that he's interested in. He values emotion, spontaneity, imagination over these ideas, that neoclassical writers were concerned with in the Enlightenment, reason and orderliness. He's rejecting those ideas. He's also rejecting the world of industry and science, and instead turns to nature as a source of his inspiration and solace. And he emphasized the commonplace. So his language resembles natural speech. The stylistic elements that we're going to be paying attention to today, because he's interested in spontaneity, right? His sentences become long and free-flowing, all right? Often with phrases that interrupt main ideas because they're spontaneous, right? There are these interruptions that just come to him, and he writes them down. The sentence structure, the syntax, all right, is going to be inverted. So I always talk about syntax by using Yoda as an example. The way Yoda speaks, right? Eat an apple, I will, is opposite of the way that we naturally speak, where we speak in subject-verb order, like I will eat an apple, right? And then finally, he uses unusual punctuation, such as dashes, all right, which are meant to show, right, this interruption of ideas. Also with this exclamation mark, which is the, as you know, the punctuation mark that expresses the most emotion, okay? He's also going to use some unusual capitalization, which is just going to be for emphasis, okay? All right, so these are the sonnets, right, that we read from in class. In class, what I asked students to do was to meet in groups of 3, where each student was responsible for one sonnet, right? And they would analyze them, because you guys are masters of sonnets. You know the sonnet form. This is not the first time that you've seen a sonnet. And then they shared their ideas with each other before we then recollected whole group. So I'm going to show you, I'm going to model for you how to analyze one of these poems, all right? And then I'm going to show you another one of these poems on a new application that you all are going to be using. So I'm going to zoom in, all right, on this poem, all right? It is a beauteous evening, calm and free. It is a beauteous evening, calm and free. The holy time is quiet as a nun, breathless with adoration. The broad sun is sinking down in its tranquility. The gentleness of heaven broods o'er the sea. Listen! The mighty being is awake, and doth with his eternal motion make a sound like thunder, everlastingly. Dear child, dear girl that walkest with me here, if thou appear untouched by solemn thought, thy nature is not therefore less divine. Thou liest in Abraham's bosom all the year, and worshipst at the temple's inner shrine, God being with thee when we know it not. So please remember, guys, the first thing that we always do with a sonnet, all right, to determine what kind of sonnet it is we look at rhyme scheme, okay? So remember, we mark rhyme scheme by looking at the word and the sound that it produces at the end of the line, all right? And we start with the letter, the first letter of the alphabet. So I'm going to start with A, right? It is a beauteous evening, calm and free. Does none rhyme with free? No, it doesn't, so I give it a B. Does sun rhyme with none or free? Well, yes, it rhymes with none. And then tranquility rhymes with free. And then C, right? Awake, make. And then we have another everlastingly. Okay, so because we have the first 4 lines rhyming in this pattern, ABBA, okay, I know immediately that this poem is Petrarchan, and you too should remember that it is Petrarchan. Petrarch is the only sonneteer who wrote in this order, all right? So that means that I know that his poem is broken into 8 lines, right? And that's called an octave. And then 6 lines, which is called the sestet. This is the turn, what we call the volta, okay? I know that Wordsworth does this weird thing. These 2 lines should technically still be B, but Wordsworth is kind of manipulating the form, because guess what? He can do that. He's that cool. All right, so let's talk about it. It's obviously a beautiful night. He tells us that. Here's that inverted order, right? It is a beauteous evening, calm and free. Typically, we would add those adjectives, right, before our noun, evening. But here, Wordsworth is essentially inverting the order, and he does that because by adding them to the end of the line, he's adding emphasis to them, right? Then, as the poem continues, we have all of this religious imagery, right? Holy time. We have this beautiful simile, quiet as a nun, right? The gentleness of heaven broods over the sea. Listen, the mighty being is awake. That mighty being obviously is, you guessed it, God, all right? And doth with his eternal motion make, right? And he then continues. We have an allusion to Abraham, all right? We talk about worshiping at the temple's inner shrine, God being there, all right? So we have all of this religious imagery. And it seems that he is suggesting that when we are out in nature, all right, we are closest to God, okay? So it's a beautiful night. The sun is setting, okay? He hears things, all right? The sounds that, anything is making. The birds, the rustling of wind, right? And tree leaves. And all of this, he says, means that God is present, right? And so when we get to this sestet, the last 6 lines where the turn is, we recognize, all right, that this speaker is with a girl, with a child, okay? And we have this emphatic expression, right? Dear child, dear girl, right? That walks with me here. If you appear untouched by solemn thought, meaning if while you're walking with me, you're not in this deep, contemplative, pensive thought like the speaker is up here, okay? He says, your nature is not therefore less divine, okay? Meaning less, godly, less spiritual. In fact, he says, you lie in Abraham's bosom all the year and worship at the temple's inner shrine, God being with thee, with you, when we know it not. Okay, so even if this little girl is not walking along with presumably her dad, okay, in this poem, and thinking about how nature, right, is where we are closest to God, that doesn't mean that her existence is not godlike. In fact, he argues that her existence is more godly because she is able to, in her innocence, right? So we have this interest again in this childlike innocence, allows for her to kind of be appreciative of nature without really doing this like metacognitive task of having to think about the fact that God is most present when we are outside in nature. Because instead, she just knows that because in her childlike state, she's, awestruck and almost even more curious, right, about all of the things that nature has to provide. So I'm going to show you now another poem, all right? So the next poem is called Composed Upon Westminster Bridge. And you might think that for a poet who is interested in returning to nature, why would he be composing a poem on Westminster Bridge? Because Westminster Bridge, as we know, is in London. So what's a dude, right, who wants to leave behind industrialized cities composing a poem on Westminster Bridge? So let's find out. He writes, earth has not anything to show more fair. Dull would he be of soul who could pass by a sight so touching in its majesty. This city now doth like a garment wear the beauty of the morning. Silent, bare, ships, towers, domes, theaters, and temples lie, open unto the fields and to the sky. All bright and glittering in the smokeless air, never did sun more beautifully steep in his first splendor, valley, rock, or hill. Ne'er sigh I, never felt a calm so deep. The river glideth at his own sweet will. Dear God, the very houses seem asleep, and all that mighty heart is lying still. So if you're noting your rhyme scheme, it again follows the Petrarchan form. Remember, by, this was likely pronounced majesty because people talked differently than we do now. And if you keep going down the lines, you'll notice that this time Wordsworth does maintain the ABBA rhyme scheme of the Petrarchan sonnet. So we've got another Petrarchan sonnet. All right, so the thing that I love about this poem is its introduction. He tells us while he's sitting upon Westminster Bridge that earth has not anything to show more fair. And remember, fair is just another way to describe something's beauty. Okay, so he starts with this hyperbolic statement, this exaggeration, that there is not a more beautiful scene than the one that he's looking at right now. In fact, he continues by saying, dull would he be of soul who could pass by. I highlighted dull and soul because in the next couple of um, digital class periods, we're going to be talking about some sound devices. And dol and sol use both assonance and consonants. So assonance is the repetition of a vowel sound that's not at the beginning of words. So this ol sound within dol and sol. And then also we have consonants, which is the repetition of a consonant sound, and here it appears at the end of the word with ol and sol and ol and sol. So he says that if somebody passed by this scene right in front of him and could not appreciate its majesty, then they would be dull of soul, okay? So he thinks that the scene that he sees before him is majestic. In fact, he capitalizes, there's that weird capitalization that we talked about, city. So he's heightening, right, this city's importance by making it a proper noun to reflect its majesty. Then he continues and he uses this simile, right, like a garment wears the beauty of morning. So now we are different from that first poem in the morning, okay? And so the things that he's noticing about what makes the city of London so beautiful in the morning is that it's silent, it's bare, okay? It is smokeless. You know, none of the factories have started operating yet. He says, never did sun more beautifully steep in his first splendor. So this is talking about a sunrise instead of a sunset, like in our previous poem. Here's his exclamation, right? Dear God, the very houses seem asleep. That's how still it is in the morning. And all that mighty heart, the mighty heart being London, right? So he's personifying here again, just like he did up here when he talked about the city wearing something. He's telling us that London is like a beating heart, because cities operate, right, like almost like a microcosm, or you could even say like a country would be the body, right, and then London would be its heart, like where, you know, the blood is pumping, right, and then it filters out, right, through industrialization's growth, essentially, into the surrounding areas. So the next poem that I want to show you is going to be that middle poem. All right, so this poem right here, The World is Too Much with Us. All right, and we're going to talk about its relationship to these two other sonnets. I'm going to show you this poem on a site, though, called Actively Learn, and that is where you are going to be doing some work over the next couple of days with some of the poems in order to, you guessed it, actively learn. So let's go look at that poem, The World is Too Much with Us. Okay, guys, so the last poem or the last sonnet of Wordsworth that we're going to look at today is called The World is Too Much with Us. And I wanted to show you a site called Actively Learn that you are similarly going to use the way that you've been using Common Lit. So thinking ahead, your next lesson is on a poem by Samuel Taylor Coleridge called The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, and it does not exist on Common Lit, but it does exist on this site, Actively Learn, and I have recorded a video on how you will log in to Actively Learn, okay, but right now I'm just going to work through this poem with you on this site, all right, and kind of talk to you about some of the features of the site. So here's The World is Too Much with Us. I'm going to read it. The world is too much with us, late and soon, getting and spending, we lay waste our powers. Little we see in nature that is ours. We have given our hearts away, a sordid boon. This sea that bears her bosom to the moon, the winds that will be howling at all hours, and are upgathered now like sleeping flowers. For this, for everything, we are out of tune. It moves us not. Great God, I'd rather be a pagan suckled and a creed outworn. So might I, standing on this pleasant lea, have glimpses that would make me less forlorn, have sight of Proteus rising from the sea, or hear old Triton blow his wreathed horn. So you'll notice as you're reading that there are some highlighted texts, and in the right hand side, the right margin, there are notes here, okay, from me, Mrs. Lassiter. Okay, so right now, most of these notes, if you click on it, are giving you key terms. All right, for sordid boon, I tell you that it's a good thing gained in a shameful way. Creed outworn is outdated beliefs. And then down here, I highlight old Triton, and it's a different color for meaning and evidence. And I'm giving you the allusions essentially, all right, so that you understand what Wordsworth is making reference to here. And I even add a little image. So you as a student have abilities while you're reading through the poem to highlight, right, your own, I'm going to highlight the first 4 lines. And now you can highlight and take notes. So you can select a category. I'm going to actually select text structure. What do you think I'm getting ready to talk about? Probably the rhyme scheme. Is, you guessed it, ABBA, another Petrarchan sonnet. You can choose the option to share with the class if you think that it is something beneficial for your peers to see, but you don't have to if you don't want to, and then you can just hit save. All right, and now you have your own annotations. So let's just talk about this poem, and then I'll show you the other features of this site, which is the questions, which are very similar to Common Lit. So the world is too much with us, late and soon. Getting and spending, we lay waste our powers. So it seems that William Wordsworth is saying that we are wasting our powers away by getting and spending too much. We're too focused on materialism and commercialism. And so in the 3rd line, he continues by saying that there's little that we see in nature anymore that is ours. We have given our hearts away. And then he starts talking about the images in nature that he's looking at. This sea, right? There's that capitalization again. So he is bestowing a title of authority, a position of power almost, elevating the sea by capitalizing it. This sea that bears her bosom to the moon, what great alliteration, right? And personification. The winds that will be howling at all hours, there's more personification, and are upgathered now like sleeping flowers. For this, for everything, we are out of tune. So he's using, right, this metaphor, okay? And I'm going to put in meaning evidence. Metaphor of music, right? Being used to describe how out of touch we are with nature. It moves us not. Great God, here's his exclamation, right? There's that exclamation mark. I'd rather be a pagan. I probably should have given you the definition, but you know what? Actually, you could highlight it and define it if you needed to. So it tells you a pagan is a person who worships many gods or goddesses or the earth or nature, a person whose religion is paganism. So he says that he'd rather be a pagan suckled in a creed outworn in these outdated beliefs so that he could stand on this lea, right? If you didn't know what that was, you could define it too. Search lea on Google. To another site. It's an open area of grassy or arable land, okay? So actually enter that if you wanted to. An open area of grassy land, and then submit it. What it looks like. It wants you to Oh, that's a bummer. Never mind. I guess it doesn't work the way that I wanted it to. Anyways, though, he's saying that he wants to be, right, this pagan, this person whose religion is with nature, which, if you think back to that first poem that we read, It is a Beauteous Evening, he seems to be talking about this connection between, God and nature, that we are connected to God when we are in nature. And so now he's returning to that idea that he would like to be, more in touch with nature. So he'd like to go back in time. So far back in time, in fact, that he says that he wishes that he would be able to see Proteus and Triton, right? These, if you remember, these Greek gods, okay? That's how much he desires to return to nature, essentially, all right? So you'll notice that there are questions as you're reading, okay? So this operates very similarly to Common Lit. So let's look at the first one together. What powers does Wordsworth refer to in the second line? All right, so we have getting and spending, we lay waste our powers. The world is too much with us late and soon, getting and spending, we lay waste our powers. What do you guys think? Humility and grace, intelligence and creativity, emotion and connection to nature, street smarts and business savvy. I definitely don't think it's the last one. I'm going to click emotion and connection to nature. Ding, ding, ding. And then it tells you, right? Wordsworth writes that through getting and spending, we lay waste our powers, suggesting that through our focus on consumerism, we lose touch with nature and our hearts, right? Cool. So now we're given another question. Which poetic devices are used in the line? The sea that bears her bosom to the moon. Select all that apply. I think I literally gave you that answer as I was reading it, right? We've got some bears her bosom, so we've got some alliteration. And the sea doesn't actually have a bosom, so we know that there is personification. So I'm going to submit that. It gives you another explanation. Oh, here's my third question. What do you think too much in the title refers to? What does Wordsworth suggest about the relationship between this excess, nature, and human well-being? So I think too much refers to our how do I want to say this? To our like overworldliness, right? That's not really a word, but our desire to be too advanced, right? Too industrialized, right? And because of this, we lose sight of what's really important, which is our connection to nature. It's probably not the best response, all right, but I'm going to submit it. So you can undo your answer if you need to, but then these are obviously the answers that I get to grade, just like I do on Common Lit, where I can provide feedback, essentially. So the last thing I want to say before I finish up talking about these sonnets, and I really appreciate you guys hanging out with me while you listen to me lecture at you. I know that it's been a pretty lengthy video, but I couldn't think of a better substitute essentially for getting you moved ahead than doing this. And I hope you found it helpful. And please comment, shoot me a line in the email, comment on the Google Slides. Let me know what you thought. Was it awful? Was it great? We don't know how long we're going to be here, guys. So, any feedback, positive or negative, would be really appreciated. But anyways, so he, in each of these 3 sonnets, which remember is like, that's an old poetic form, okay? We read about sonnets, we studied them in our Renaissance movement, which is, you know, it's a couple hundred years previous to this. And Petrarch, which is the sonnet that he chooses to model his own after, was writing, even before Shakespeare and Spenser were. So it's interesting to think about, like, why choose the Petrarchan sonnet, right, as the poetic form to model his own after? Why not choose an English sonneteer like Shakespeare and Spenser? And I think it really is, emphasizing his point that we should return, just like he wrote at the end of this poem, I wish I could be like a pagan. I wish I could go back to the time when people's religion was worshiping nature, right? Worshiping these Greek gods. So it makes sense then that he would choose the original, like, oldest sonnet form, the sonnet of Petrarch, in order to deliver his idea that not only do we need to, return to nature, but we need to return to a simpler time when nature was more valued than Wordsworth seems to think it is now. So I hope that helped you guys understand the sonnets. There's one more poem that you're responsible for doing on your own. It is called I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud, and it's been shared with you through Commonlit. It is not a sonnet. It is very accessible, though. And that's what you're going to do for homework, and then essentially you will have been caught up on our Wordsworth our Wordsworth lesson, essentially. So thanks for hanging with me. I'll catch you later.